The needs of the military change over time. They're likely to need more buildings and vehicles during times of war than they are during times of peace. And so when a war comes to an end, they might no longer need some of their assets. Those assets might be sold off if it's convenient or practical to sell them. Or they might become fascinating examples of military abandonment, like everything you're about to see in this video. Prior to the commencement of the Second World War, Adolf Hitler oversaw the rearmament of Germany. Part of this rearmament process included the creation of large military training areas known as lagers. Lager 3 in Forst-Zinna, built in 1934, was one such lager, and eventually became Hitler's favorite. That led to it later being named Adolf Hitler Lager, in honor of the dictator. At first, Adolf Hitler Lager was a meeting place for the SS, but after 2 years, it became the main training camp of the Artillerieschule Jüterbog. Many of the German army's tank drivers were sent here for training during the early 1940s. It was the Soviet army who eventually seized it from the defeated Germans at the end of the war, giving it a new purpose as a center for displaced persons either from war-ravaged Eastern Europe or liberated concentration camps. The Soviet army eventually returned to using it for military purposes, but added a small zoo and a cinema to entertain soldiers and their families. The facility was largely obsolete by the end of the 20th century, and was formally closed down and abandoned in 2007. Some of the more historically significant parts of the camp will be spared from demolition, but the remainder is slowly being knocked down. Once upon a time, many years ago, the 4 broken satellite dishes in this field in Lincolnshire, England, were the country's first line of defense against the possibility of an aerial attack from Germany or Russia. Today, they're lying on their sides, exposed to the elements and gathering rust. That's no way to treat them after their years of valuable service, but it's the harsh reality of the closure of the RAF Bentwaters base. The Royal Air Force radar station opened in 1938 and stayed open until 1955. It was tasked with detecting incoming German air raids during the Second World War years and serving as a deterrent against the possibility of the Soviets launching an attack in the years that followed. The satellite dishes used during the war were actually smaller than the ones you can see at the site today. These much larger dishes were added by NATO under the Allied Command Europe in the post-war years. NATO continued to operate the site until the 1980s, by which time its facilities were considered to be obsolete. The whole station was taken apart piece by piece, with little other than these rusty dishes left by 1996. They stand as a testimony to what once went on here. While we're checking out old Royal Air Force bases in England, let's move to RAF Bentwaters in Suffolk. The facility is a product of the Second World War, with construction starting in 1942 and ending in 1944, under the guidance of RAF Bomber Command. The triangle-shaped base remained in use by the RAF for the rest of the war, and was then loaned to the United States Air Force, who used it for Cold War operations between 1951 and 1993. Had the USSR attacked the rest of Europe during the Cold War years, RAF Bentwaters would have played a key role in its defense. The US had no further need for it after 1993, and so it was handed back to the UK Ministry of Defense, who immediately declared it obsolete and closed it. The area is known these days as Bentwaters Parks, and has served as a filming location for many television shows and movies. The many planes, helicopters, and other military vehicles that still stand at the site are all genuine, although all weaponry has been removed from them. The most interesting building at the site is the so-called Star Wars building, with its thick concrete blast-proof walls. Something top secret must have gone on in here, and we'll probably never know what it was. The biggest diesel submarine the Russian Navy ever built is known as B-307, but she's no longer under the sea. In fact, she's been dry for quite a long time, standing somewhat improbably on grassland in the city of Tolyatti. The massive undersea vessel was built during the late 1970s and began her military service in 1980. She'd clearly have posed a threat to any enemy submarine she came into contact with, but her military service was largely uneventful. B-307 wandered the seas between the Mediterranean and the Barents for 21 years without sustaining so much as a scratch in battle, and was retired from the Northern Fleet in 2001. At that point, she was immediately bought by a Tolyatti-based museum which borrowed 6 military tractors to drag its new acquisition onto this patch of grass, and then decided it would be easier to open the museum there than try to move it any further. The Somme-class submarine is now designated as the Togliatti Museum of Technology, but hasn't been open for several years. She'll never sail again, but it would be nice if the museum could be reopened so she still had a purpose of some kind to serve. There's an old mushroom farm in Hungary that could tell you a thing or two about Soviet nuclear armaments if its walls could talk. This facility, the precise location of which is undisclosed, was first built as an ammunition store for the Hungarian army. The Soviet army took control of it during the 1950s and changed its purpose almost immediately, turning it into a nuclear storage depot and keeping it that way, until they eventually withdrew after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. The doomsday weapons that these buildings once held were secured in concrete tunnels beneath the floors, protected by 10-ton steel blast doors at each end. It's thought that up to 21 warheads were once stored here. After abandonment, the place went from being a facility that could create mushroom clouds to a facility that made mushrooms. The tunnels proved to be perfect for growing mushrooms. And while we're not sure we'd want to buy mushrooms grown in tunnels that might be radioactive, during its peak years, it grew and sold 80 tons each year. The farm has ceased operations in the semi-recent past and, as you can see, the whole site is now abandoned. For obvious reasons, it wouldn't have been prudent for the Soviets to keep all their nuclear weapons and warheads in one place. They scattered them all over their territory, including the site of Pleuchstein in Lithuania, where we find the Divina missile silo. From this position, it would have been possible for the USSR to launch a nuclear missile at the United Kingdom and strike it within minutes, giving Britain almost no time to respond to or defend against the attack. The UK wasn't the only country that was threatened by this sophisticated military base. The Soviets could have just as easily fired on any target in Western Europe. It was here at this base in 1959 that the Soviet Union began the development of the R-12 missile, a powerful warhead capable of delivering an enormous nuclear bomb. It was R-12 missiles that were lined up in Cuba during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, representing an existential threat to the United States of America. Most of the Pleuchstein base is underground, hidden away in tunnels 100 feet deep. The existence of the facility was totally unknown to Western intelligence forces until 1978, when it was found by U.S. reconnaissance teams. By that point, the missiles had already been removed and the site abandoned. The circumstances of its abandonment are unknown, but it's since become a dark tourism hotspot. Somewhere in a top-secret location on the coast of France, perhaps known only to the military and a small group of urban explorers, is the Atlantic Ghost Fleet. Hidden in a bay between sheer cliffs, this collection of old warships is still afloat, but none of them are ever likely to be recalled to active service. Their best years have been and gone. One of the ships moored here is the former flagship of the French Navy, built during the 1950s and remaining in service until the 1990s, armed to the teeth with anti-aircraft guns, missile systems, and storage for attack helicopters. Amazingly, some of the Mazurka missiles are still aboard the rusting vessel. The control panels that would allow them to be fired are still there too. It's thought that the ships have been kept here in case they're needed for spare parts, so none of their equipment has been dismantled or scrapped. It's hard to imagine why any modern vessel would ever need equipment this old, but here it all is. While the vessels are retired and disused, the area around them is still regularly patrolled by the French police. The explorers who acquired these images broke the law by doing so we don't recommend that anyone should follow in their footsteps. There was a time where if you wanted to know anything about jet engines or gas turbines in the United Kingdom, you had to go to the National Gas Turbine Establishment in Fleet, Hampshire. The enormous facility, better known as Pistock, opened shortly after the Second World War and remained active for more than 50 years. Aside from playing a vital role in the development of British jet engines, it was also invaluable to the British and American militaries. Captured Soviet engines obtained during the Cold War were brought here for analysis, so the Allies could stay informed about the capabilities of their enemies. The huge, sprawling site looks a little like an alien spacecraft, but has been closed since the year 2000. During its useful lifetime, it tested the engines of the V-Bomber, Harrier, and Tornado. Even Concorde's engines were tested here, revved up to 2,000 miles per hour with an incredible atmospheric pressure equivalent to flying at 60,000 feet. Those Concorde tests happened in Test Cell 4, the largest test tunnel of its kind in the world. Even now, there are still a few jet engines inside Pistock, but they'll soon be destroyed along with the rest of the facility to make way for a new retail distribution center. Standing on the fringes of a farmer's field in Hungary are a few rows of MiG-21 and Su-22 aircraft that officially belong to the Hungarian Air Force. Unofficially, it doesn't look like the Hungarian Air Force is actually doing much with them. The seemingly forgotten planes are easily identified by the insignia and logos that are still clearly visible on their paintwork, but the logos also give away their age. If these were modern Hungarian Air Force planes, they'd have low visibility insignia and NATO logos. These high visibility colors, patterned after the Hungarian flag, haven't been in use since the 1980s. Which gives us a rough date in terms of when these planes arrived in this field. For the plane enthusiasts among you, there are 3 different types of MiG-21 here. There are MiG-21MFs, MiG-21 BISs, and MiG-21 UMs. Oddly, the Su-22 planes parked alongside them have desert camouflage paintwork, and a few even have bumblebees painted on their noses for unknown reasons. Locals say the Su-22s were delivered during the 1990s, although nobody seems to know why. It's possible that they're a standby or emergency fleet, but it's doubtful that they'd be fit for purpose after so long stood in the open. The French government was worried about the possibility of invasion from Nazi Germany before the Second World War began. They even built a series of defensive fortifications known as the Maginot Line. Not that they did much good when the Germans eventually plowed through them. The largest of those facilities was Ouvrage Roshanvie, close to the border of France and Luxembourg, which became operational in 1935. During the Battle of France in 1940, the Germans effectively bypassed the position and then attacked it from behind on June 22nd, piercing the fortification with explosive weapons and causing extensive damage. The French surrendered, and the Germans seized Roshanvie and used it as barracks and troop quarters. It was eventually retaken by American forces in 1944 and handed back to the French after the war came to an end. Since then, it served as a NATO command center, and then again as a French Army command center, but it's been all but abandoned since 1998. A small military presence ensures that the public stays out of the area, but the site itself is believed to be inactive. Back in 1835, it's fair to say that the Dutch government was still a little sore about the secession of Belgium 5 years earlier. They were angry and paranoid and fearful of more military action in the future. To guard against that threat, they built Fort Wutztic to defend the Westerschelde. Almost 190 years later, the fort is still standing. The design of the facility is an interesting blend of the old and the new when it comes to 19th century military thinking. It has a hexagonal design and a moat, like an old castle, but it also has bomb-proof chambers. It took until 1839 for the Dutch to finish building Wutztic, which was the same year that the country signed the Treaty of London with Belgium and put an end to hostilities. In other words, the fort was obsolete from the moment it was finished. It was almost forgotten about until the Germans noted its strategically useful location and seized it during the Second World War. They dug tunnels and bunkers beneath the old fort and also used part of it as a prison. The Dutch Military of Defense kept it in use as a storage site after the war, before eventually closing it in 1997. There's a small information center at the site today, but the fort itself is empty. The Ghost Fleet of Mallows Bay was built and put on standby during the First World War. More than a century later, the wooden-hulled fleet is still waiting to be called up. The past 100 years haven't been kind to the unwanted ships, which were built cheaply with wooden hulls. The hulls have largely rotted away, some of the vessels are half sunk, and local marine life has moved in to claim the space. You won't see any serving soldiers aboard these ships in Nanjemoy, Maryland, USA, but you'll see plenty of birds. The remains of just under 230 ships have been counted floating on this part of the Potomac River, making this the largest cluster of shipwrecks anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Plans were made to scrap the fleet during the 1960s out of fear that they'd pollute the Potomac as they decayed, but a study found that the reverse was true. The wooden frames of the vessels pose no threat, and taking them apart now would severely disrupt the thriving ecosystem. They were allowed to stay in place on those grounds and will remain here until they eventually crumble away to nothing. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!